Well, dear colleagues, let me welcome all of you on our third international roundtable, which we launched 3 years ago, and we decided to make it in English because we want as many foreign colleagues who do not speak Russian and do not understand Russian, let them participate in our meetings and share the results of their research, what is very important for us. There is the whole bunch of very interesting problems to which we so far do not have experts in Russia. And for this reason, we invite our most dear colleagues from Central Europe to share the results of their research, to explain their methodology and expectations. And for this reason, each year we choose one notion or one term. And our first roundtable was dedicated to the Danube as a Central European river. Our second roundtable was dedicated to multiple identities, and Andrea Zайдлер was given an excellent paper on Hungarus, and we expect to have it as an article in the forthcoming issue of our yearbook, Central European Studies. And this year we return to a geographical term, and from river to soil. We are talking about Burgenlande as a historical region. It's a very new topic for us because in our institute, Burgenlande is only studied by experts in Slavic languages, and they are mostly interested in Burgenland Croats. And they call them, maybe uncritically, Gradišćanski Hrvati, and they I think they do not have the whole perspective of this very complicated and interesting region. And we are very glad that in our roundtable we have one philologist and one historian, because that's the reason of our interdisciplinary conferences, roundtables, seminars. And we would like to have two different perspectives from two different branches of human sciences. And we start with Andrea Zайдлер, University of Vienna, exploring the archives of the Protestant church in the town of Oberwart in Burgenland. Andrea, please.
Just a second. I will try to share my files with you.
Yes. It's on its way to us.
Okay, so before I start, let me just say thank you for inviting me again. Can you see the?
Yes.
The file, okay. Thank you for inviting me again. And I found it very interesting last time. And I'm happy to be a part of this group again. I myself, my background is Hungarian. I was born in Sopron, but I was brought up in the region of Burgenland. So I was brought up in Oberwart, and I visited schools there, and later on studied at the University of Vienna and became a professor here as well. So my topic is 18th century literature, cultural history. That's how I know Olga. And I just recently started to study the region of Burgenland, because we found that with my colleagues, with my colleague Cira Marta, with whom I'm working quite closely, we found that there is no sufficient literature about scientific literature, no sufficient foundings about this area of Austria, which we don't know the reason for, but that's the case. So I am proud to show you. I don't know, do you see this now, or you don't see it? Yeah, we have just issued a book on Burgenland. It's called Region der Vielfalt, and it contains 18 different papers on the history of Burgenland, on the minorities of Burgenland, and literature, on cultural events and things like that. So I cannot send you the book, but what I can do, Olga, is I can send you and your colleagues maybe the PDF. But I think it's also an open access issue. So I will try to get you the link. And although it's in German, but maybe for some of you, it's not a problem. So this is only for those who are really interested in the topic. It's brand new. It just left the press a couple of days ago. Okay. So this was my first step towards Burgenland. And within this book, we have my colleague Chiramarta, as I mentioned before, we had started to do some research on the archives of the Reformed parish in Oberwart. I don't know who of you is very familiar with the region. Oberwart is, I will tell you more about the history of Oberwart, but Oberwart is, I find, a very interesting city. It's in the southern part of Burgenland, in, let's say, 30 kilometers from Sombathai. And it has a multilingual, it has a multilingual population. People there are speaking Hungarian and German. Not everybody, of course, because times have changed, but it was in former times a Hungarian settlement. And that changed, of course, in course of history. And it is a German and partly Hungarian city now. They have the infrastructure in both languages, so you can attend Hungarian schools, you can attend German speaking schools, or bilingual schools, I should better call it. And they have a big Hungarian minority there. And it's also interesting that as the times are changing and as the population changes, after 89 and even later, after Hungary entering the European Union, and then 7 years later, as you know, Hungarians were allowed to come and work in Austria, not only in Austria, in the whole European Union. So since they got the freedom to move within the European Union, many Hungarians settled in Burgenland and settled down in Burgenland. They are working there, they are living there, and their children go to school there. So the population has changed a lot in the recent, I would say, 25, 30 years. So when we talk about this area, we can no longer talk about the historical Hungary or the historical Burgenland. This we have to, I think, have a regional approach. As we have to have in mind that regions are changing, are constantly, it's a constant flow. They are changing, and the Hungarian population changed very much from the minority into a population that is, I would say, almost dominated already by Hungarians who emigrated to Burgenland or who are working there and go home every day. So this borderline is very much in Hungarian hands again. But we can talk about this later. If you have any questions about the Burgenland, we can talk about this later. I would now like to start with my paper that will tell you the archives of the Reformed parish in Oberwart. So Oberwart, as the name Oberwart, in a document for the first time in 1327. So that's 700 years ago, at the times of Charles Robert of Anjou, who entrusted Nikolaus of Oberwart with the reorganization of the so-called Wart. The border guards, Wart means guard. The border guards were there to watch the border strip between the castles of Bernstein. Bernstein is about 20 kilometers from Oberwart to the northwest, and Güssing, which is in the south, Németújvár, the Hungarian, it was later a Batyányi castle. to report an approach of the enemy to the king as soon as possible, and to prevent enemy passage. So Wart is a very important word for us, or name, Oberwart. In the 14th and 15th century, many border guards rose to become petty nobles with a peasant way of life. So they were peasants, but they got nobles, petty nobles, and were still living on their farms, doing their farm jobs, everyday jobs. In the sources of Ober- and Unterwart, the inhabitants of the village are mentioned as nobles for the first time in 1482. So that means this is not the big noble families like the Botjanis or the Olmaschis. This is families called Benke, Odorian, and so on, but they got nobility, they received nobility from that age on. The area was called Kapitányság or Őrnagyság in Hungarian. The privileges were confirmed again, so these privileges from 1482, they were confirmed again in 1582 by Rudolf II, and in 1611 by Mátyás II. And the documents of the upper and lower wardens also list the 65 families, mostly mentioned only with baptismal names, who were granted estates at that time, so who became nobles and were granted estates. I mention a few of these names: Adam, Odorian, Böcskör, Farkas, Gángol, Pál, Sisko, Sheper, Zambo. So all these families are still there. You find these family names still in Oberwart. Most of them, I'm sure, are not even aware of the fact that they once were nobles. So it's just to list a few whose descendants, as I said, can still be met in the Wart today. The whole area around Oberwart, Unterwart, is called the Wart shortly, with a short term. These privileges were to grant them more extensive religious freedoms a few centuries later in the course of the Reformation and the Catholic Reform. The inhabitants of the town were not only able to defend themselves against any influence or even encroachment by the aristocratic landowners of the surrounding areas, they also retained their Hungarian identity and language in the midst of the growing number of German-speaking inhabitants, also due to settlement. The language island of Oberwart, Unterwart, Sziget in the Wart, they are still there. I was using one for me, very interesting source during my research. There was a certain historian called Bolog who wrote about Oberwart in the Kronprinzenwerk. Do you know what the Kronprinzenwerk is? This is a big 20, I don't know how many volumes edition, edited by Rudolf, Kronprinz Rudolf, and it consists of the description of each part of the monarchy, of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And there is also a description of Oberwart, which is very interesting if you compare it with the situation today. So that's 150 years ago, this was written. So Bolog is the author of the paper on Oberwart in this Kronprinzenwerk. And according to him, Oberwart was a large municipality at that time already, so at the end of the 19th century, with 3,417 inhabitants, with the seat of the district court, the chair's judge's office, a tax office, and the post office. There was a Catholic, a Protestant AB, so Reformed, and a Protestant AB, Augsburgisches Bekenntnis, and a Reformed church in the village. We will learn about, we do not learn more about the village in this description from 1896. In the 120 years that have passed since then, Oberwart has changed significantly. With the conclusion of the peace treaty of Trianon and the subsequent geologic political changes in the region, the village grew in importance due to the preeminent position it occupied in the district of Oberwart. It became a town in 1939, so when Burgenland was Austria already and not Hungary anymore. And in the course of the 20th century, increasingly became a school and administrative center of southern Burgenland. I will maybe change the picture now, so not to bore you. Increasingly, the once Hungarian population declined numerically in the course of the 20th century. The Hungarian language was gradually eliminated from the school system, and German, the language of the now majority society, increased in dominance. I'm sure we will talk about this process of 1920 and how Burgenland became part of Austria. And so I'm not talking about this here anymore. So now to the Reformed Church congregation in Oberwart, which is significant when we talk about Hungarian minority in Oberwart. First, to the history of the Reformed Church. You see on my foils, those pictures were taken in September 21, so they are pretty new and pretty accurate. This is the church and the parish, but this is the old parish. They have a new building as well, which I didn't take a picture of, but you can see very well that the church, the building of the church, is from the 18th century and the tower has been built in the 19th century. I will not go into details. You know why that happened. So about the history of the Reformed Church in Oberwart, there are comprehensive source studies and research works on the history of the Reformed Church in Oberwart from both the 19th and the 20th century. We would like to focus here as a source of a short summary on a dissertation of the Reformed pastor Imre Gyenge. He's an important name if we talk about the Reformed Church of Oberwart, Imre Gyenge. The reason for this is that he seems to have been one of the few who based his research on the source material found in the archives of the parish in Oberwart. So Imre Gyenge was, as I said, a Reformed pastor and a very interesting personality as well, very much interested in history, a very clear-minded, very open-minded pastor whom the whole congregation loved a lot. I knew him personally. He died a couple of years ago, but he wrote a really good dissertation on the parish and on their belongings. So he writes, I quote this in Hungarian now because the dissertation is in Hungarian. Egyre kevesebben vannak ugyanis olyan lelkészek, vagy az irattár feldolgozásához egyébként megfelelő képzettséggel rendelkező személyek, akik a magyar nyelvű anyaggal meg tudnának birkózni. A magyar nyelvű anyag pedig a történeti emlék nagyobb részét képezi. So he writes that there are only a few pastors or people or scholars working archives who are ready to read material or use material or analyze material in Hungarian, written in Hungarian. But this is the Hungarian sources in the archives are a big part of our Hungarian origin or our remembrance of being Hungarian here. What we are primarily, my colleague and me, interested in here is of the Reformation in Oberwart, as well as possible sources of the archives that also prove these early dates. Research assumes that it began with the conversion of Count Balthasar III Batthyány. He died in 1590, in the middle of the 15th century, with the 16th century, with the influence exerted by his pastor István Bejte. So these names are very important if you deal with the history of the early history of Burgenland or Western Hungarian. Western Hungary, Count Balthasar III Batthyány, and the whole Batthyány family was of a huge, Adam Batthyány, they were of huge influence in this area. The whole area belonged to them, in fact. And István Bejte, who was also a pastor and who was a very strong influencer as far as the Batthyány family was concerned. Not last through his book printing house. So this István Bejte had a book printing house, which is also remarkable, and the possibilities it offered for spreading Protestant doctrine. So these Batthyánys at that time, they were not Catholics, but they they belonged to the Reformed congregation, and Bejte was supporting this through his printing press and through the book distribution. In 1548 is assumed to be the earliest provable date. The first pastor is in Oberwart. The first pastor is assumed to be János Gál, who died in 1616 after 40 years of service and who was active in Oberwart during his first years of service. The two denominations AB and HB separated only after the Synod of Chepre in 1591, so the Lutheranians and the Calvinists. There is evidence that the religious community HB built a tower in the beginning of the 17th century, and the school was already in operation in 1655, when Miklós Fülöp was employed there as a teacher. At that time, the Oberwart parish belonged to the Günz church parish, later the Wart church parish, Őrség Egyházmegye. And the pastor of the parish from 1650 was János Szeremlei. In 1663, 1673, or 1677, the dates are contradictory. There is also a mention of 1673. The parish was taken over by supporters of the Catholic reform. The church and school were occupied, the priests and teachers were expelled, and the population was mistreated and forced to convert into Catholic again. The archives of the parish are documents that speak for the later dates. In 1681, the fate of the Reformed Church changed for the better. On the occasion of the Sopron Synod, it was proclaimed an articular church. And from now on, the parish was allowed to meet in his own building, a wooden church at that time. Both the preacher and the teacher were allowed to it. This church, the exact location of which is unknown to this day, served for about 100 years until 1772. The oldest documents date back to the 16th century, the latest ones reach to the present. Little more is known about the clergymen of that time than their names and the time of their activity, but they all came from the territory of the former Kingdom of Hungary. The majority of Oberwart's population had been reformed during the 17th century. Since the school formed an important part of the cultural life and was attached to the parish, sources also give the names of the teachers from the year 1665 on. So all this we find in the archives. From the year 77, the construction of a more permanent church than a wooden one was planned. According to documents, the initiative for the collection came from two presbyters, Károly Szeremlei and his wife Judith Szentpéteri, as well as László Csernel. These two men personally presented a petition to Maria Theresia in 1764. We will see a photo of it, asking for approval to rebuild the church. The documents that prove this are still in the archives of the parish. In addition of the petition itself, they also bear numerous signatures and stamps of the noble citizens of Oberwart who supported the construction. After lengthy studies, listening to pro and con voices, Maria Theresia finally gave permission in 1769 for the construction of the church, which was completed in 1773. You see the picture here. Its master builder was Christoph Preising from the village of Pinkafeld, about 10 kilometers from Oberwart. In 1810, the church tower was finally built and the bell was consecrated. The first centuries of the history of the Reformed Church parish are documented by numerous documents, which are in the archives, but they were also often interpreted in contradictory way, which is why a more precise source-based research of the history of both the church and the school would still have to be done. The 19th and 20th centuries and their history are already well documented and traceable through source evidence and accurate books. And the secondary literature also provides a good overview of it. Let me now turn to the archives of the Reformed Church congregation. The Reformed Church congregation in Oberbad can thus look back on a history of more than 450 years, a period during which many deeds and documents have accumulated, which fortunately for research have also been preserved. The archive of the Reformed Church in Oberbad is in the new parsonage building built in 1972-73. I don't have a picture of that, and on the church grounds. The documents are mostly stored in a well-developed basement room in bookshelves. Older, more valuable writings from the 17th and 18th century are stored accordingly. The formats of the documents are the following: comprehensive bound books, handwritten, writings bound only after their creation, and individual deeds and documents written on sheets of papers, as well as private correspondence. From the 1940s onwards, there are also some typed documents. Thus, according to format, the holdings contain letters, deeds, minute books, financial records, matriculation books, photographic material, that's of course 20th century, posters, the oldest of which date from the late 17th century, the most recent from the present. So here is an initial description of the holdings. The convolute one, I don't know if everybody can read, also translated it into English. So several documents loosely bound, Hungarian and Latin, then Hungarian again, convolute 2, 13th, 17th century prayers and sermons preserved in an envelope. Then convolute 3, an account book beginning with 1747. I will show you a photo of that later on. Then volume 4, so these are books already, an inventory from 1814 to 1847 with inventory of farmland, letters connected with the building of the church, instruments belonging to the communion table, building of the parish, the book of the parish, book of the schools, Bible, and so on. And volume 5, minute book of the parish, from two different books, one from starting from 1844, the other one from 1892. And there is one finishes in 1901 and the other one starts a bit earlier. I don't know why. Volume 6, again, minute books of the Presbyterian meetings of the Reformed Church congregation in Oberbad with various manuscripts. This is especially interesting for those who are doing their research on 20th century and on the whole Trianon history, because there are various manuscripts that complain about the situation of the schools, about the situation of the language, about the language restrictions concerning the Hungarian language, and so on. So this is an interesting material, and also another protocol book from 1928 to 48. So this is what we found in the archives. I'll show you some photos now. They are very amateur photos because I took them with my mobile phone. So this is this very old Hungarian prayers and sermons I was talking about. We have transcribed them, but since Olga said that nobody speaks Hungarian here except for one colleague, I didn't add the translation. So we are not sure whether this is a prayer or a sermon, but there is a good couple of prayers like this in an envelope. They are, if you see that they have been eaten up by worms already. So if nobody takes care of them or handles them properly, they will just disappear, fall apart within a short period of time. Then Confessioni Adiatorum. So this is a book about donations to the church. Is also very interesting. You see, it's the title is in Latin, but the book itself is a mixture of Hungarian and Latin. This is one of the I find it very interesting material as far as linguistic studies or history of Hungarian language is concerned, because from the language point of view, from the linguistic point of view, a very interesting material. Of course, we didn't transcribe all these things. We just did the first survey. So this is Balthasar III Batthyány's letter to his administrator. In this letter, this is in fact a letter where he advises his administrator to leave the population of Oberwart in peace, and it says that they don't have to, they can remain in their religion, and that they have to be accepted as a community, and that Balthasar Batthyány, the Batthyányis had no power over this little village of Oberwart, over this area. They had no power. Oberwart had a freedom, they were guaranteed freedom. So this is the request letter to Maria Theresia, where the village asks her it's in Hungarian. The village asks her to give her to allow them to build a new church. As I said, we don't know where the old church was before, the former church. So, but this church is still there. And you see here the names Zambo, Pongrácz, Imre, Zambo, and all of them had their own seals and Farkas, Imre. So I find this very interesting. This could be a research on its own, somebody who is interested in heraldics and in seals. Birth and death register, many of them, of course, also very interesting concerning the population of Hungarian in many respects, interesting for historians as well as for cultural studies and language studies and history of religion, of course, and regional history, very interesting. And then there's a protocol. I took a photo of 20th century. You see from the handwriting that it's completely different than the previous one, for instance, was. And these are books already. Yeah. And it's, as you see, in Hungarian. It's written in Hungarian. This is completely in Hungarian, no German or Latin. And you see the same names here, Böcskör, János, and so on. So they remained over the centuries in this village and stayed there. So this is, as I said, just first inventory that my colleague Marta Cire from the University of Vienna also and I have made. Unfortunately, we have finished this first findings and also published them in this book, but we are now trying to find financial means to have the possibility to work on this material. It would be very interesting to not only to read, but also to conserve, to preserve these documents, to digitalize them. But we haven't found the financial means up to now, although we wouldn't even need too much money, but still this is maybe something that is a task for a larger, maybe a state institution that can pay for it from its, provide the funds from its own budget. But we are not at the end with our efforts. We are still trying, and we are doing it step by step. So the first step we have, as I said, we're finished now. And we do our private little research now on parts of it, and on maybe on the sermons and the prayers now as a next step. But we are in the moment not in the position to digitalize the material and to put it online, which would be our big dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for an excellent, for me as historian, micro-historic approach to local religious community and the archives we have from them, from their long history in the 21st century. Are there any questions maybe from participants? In chat, you may write us in chat, or yes, we have a question from our colleague from Yekaterinburg, Julia But. Julia, please.
Good day. I'm not sure whether my microphone is working. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
okay. So thank you very much, Andrea, for your fascinating talk. And I have actually 3 questions, if I may ask them. So first of all, I'm curious whether it was common practice by Maria Theresa to support or to approve this sort of building and rebuilding of the Reformed churches. So did she do it easily or reluctantly? And was this church finally rebuilt? This rebuilding, was it financed by those nobles who sent Maria Theresa this request letter? And I'm very, very curious about the thing you said about the school materials which were found by you and your colleague in the archive. You mentioned, at least it was on the slide, that there were a Bible and some material on the ethic lessons. So can we have any idea what kind of ethic lessons were taught to the kids, or maybe teenagers at this parish school? Thank you.
Well, to your first question, maybe Olga can tell you more about this. I don't know whether it was a common practice of Maria Theresa to build churches herself. As far as I remember from our research, they have requested the building twice, so it was not a very easy decision, as it seems, from the Empress. But yes, they got the permission, and I don't think that it's an outstanding story. Maybe it's outstanding because it was Maria Theresa and not her son, who in fact, of course, acknowledged all the religious freedom in the Habsburg monarchy. Maybe this has to do with, or most probably it has to do with the long history of this Reformed Church in Oberwart and of the particular rights the town of Oberwart had, the municipality of Oberwart had at that time. I don't know. I would have to go deeper into the details, but this is, for instance, something that would be very interesting to know more about. This Maria Theresa's order to allow them to build a church. I don't know more than I can tell you now. The second question is about the schools, right? Well, this is also, we have, this is the first survey that we made. So we just went there and checked what they have and filtered out some interesting topics that would be worth to continue to do research on them. So we didn't go into details. I cannot tell you this. The only details that we found was in concerning schools was in this 20th century material that I told you in this minute book, where we found a lot of letters where the teachers were complaining, but that's 20th century already, where the teachers were complaining to the government, then from in Burgenlande already, that the pupils are not allowed to speak Hungarian, and that Hungarian lectures or Hungarian teaching is forbidden. and or restricted, or the German language is gaining a huge dominance over the Hungarian. So this is what we found on first sight, you know. But we would love to go, or we would love anybody who is interested to go, of course, deeper into this material. I just wanted to show you how rich these sources are, and from how many ways you can approach it.
Okay, thank you very much. We will be expecting for the results of your further investigation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Am I right that this church was the so-called articulated place? So probably, yes. Maybe we shall comment to our listeners that under Leopold and under Charles VI, there were special decrees which prescribed in which places Protestants may officially have their churches. For this reason, if a particular church was on this list, the community had right to apply for some support or some permission from the Emperor King or Empress Queen. And maybe this sort of answer to Julia's question, was it an exception or a rule? Maybe for the articulated places it was a sort of rule. And of course Maria Theresa didn't like Protestants, but she arranged some mechanism of communication with them through special representatives of the communities and special officials appointed to secure this communication. That's what I know from also maybe more general studies. And may I ask then, this church functions now as a Reformed church?
Yes, it functions as a Reformed church, and also the priest who is there now, Richard Kardos, he is also from Hungary. So all the priests that I have known, and also going back in history in these minute books, etc., I can only find Hungarian origin priests there. Some of them even coming from now Romania. And the Hungarian population of Romania, and yeah, and that continues. So that this is also because the population, the Reformed population of Oberwart is mainly Hungarian.
Is it an exception of this Reformed church in Burgenland, in nowadays Burgenland or Austrian Burgenland, or there are more Reformed churches which function with smaller or bigger communities now?
No,
because
in
we have an idea
yeah.
of a Counter-Reformation which leaves a little space for Protestants, and especially so close to the Austrian lands. So how is it?
No,
now?
this is the only Reformed church that was the only Reformed church, and as I said, the rights go back to the Synod of Sopron. So that's the only Reformed church.
I see. More questions probably, or in chat. And then I would like to ask about this document with many signatures. Is it a copy in the local archive, or did you find it somewhere in the central archive where it was sent to? So
no, it's a copy in the local archive.
Mm-hmm.
A copy in the local archive, but I'm sure there should be a copy of it in the same. But who knows? But this was we found that in the very special archive of the church.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. More questions probably about. And if we are talking with you as a philologist, then may I put a more general question about linguistic situation in the present day Burgenland? Which languages are, or vernacular, probably alive, and which are taught, which are spoken, and how is it correlation between languages and ethnic language and national groups? Just a small comment, because it's very precious for us before the next speaker.
Yeah, well, there is, you know, since the 80s, the two minorities in Burgenland have been guaranteed their rights. So this is the Hungarians and the Croats. Okay, and I think that the Hungarian minority, we don't call them minority again anymore. We call them Volksgruppe. I wouldn't know the English expression for it. But they have guaranteed they've guaranteed their full rights. So they have, as I said, their schools. They are allowed to have their in jurisdiction to use their own language and things like that. And the names of the cities have to be in both languages and so on. So I find that very good. And but these two minorities are very strong in Burgenland, and then there is also the Roma minority. Yeah, and the Roma minority is mainly around Oberwart as well, Oberwart, Unterwart, and in this area, and they also have the full rights of a minority nowadays, and yeah, they're also strong. They are all well organized. They all have their own activities as a group. They have their activities that are financed also by the state, and yeah, they do. I would say the Hungarians and the Croats and the Roma equally do a lot to maintain their identities there. And I couldn't tell you figures now, but there is a figure that around 170,000 Hungarians at the moment in Austria. This is, of course, not only the minority. This is most of them are moved to Austria, as I said, after after Hungary entered the European Union. So there is a lot of Hungarians in Burgenland now who are not minority Hungarians, but who are immigrants, in fact, to Austria. But nevertheless, it does the case good, because the Hungarian is spoken widely now, and the need for Hungarian culture is growing. I would say yes, and yeah. The language situation, of course, the children of those people who moved to Austria, they learn German very quickly, but they speak, of course, very well Hungarian. There was in former years, when I was a child, the Hungarian language was, of course, because of the border of the Iron Curtain, the Hungarian language lost a lot of its prestige at that time, you know, and even people who spoke Hungarian didn't use the language because they didn't want to be stigmatized as Hungarians. Well, not my family, of course, because we moved to Austria in '56. After the Hungarian Revolution. So my family, yeah, they spoke Hungarian at home. And at the moment, I would say that the situation is good. There are Hungarian schools, there are Hungarian kindergartens, there are, of course, accordingly, Croatian schools and kindergartens and everything. The Croatians are even a stronger minority. They have more power. They are very influential also in political respect. The Hungarians, not that much, but still they are living more or less peacefully. And there is also broadcasting in Hungarian and Croatian in the Rom language. And yeah, so they're allowed to do what they want to do. Of course, they are underfinanced, all of them, but still, as we say, how do you say this? Too much to die and too little to survive, but still they are they are acknowledged and they have all their own full rights.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I think it's time to go to our second speaker. And I'm really very, very grateful to Dr. David László Törő for accepting our invitation, because his topic, which he's going to talk about, is one of our prime interests in our seminar, and historical narratives and invented identities and quarrels around notions, territories, and national past. That's what fascinates us as organizers. And for this reason, let me with satisfaction introduce Dr. David Laszlo Töre from the University of Debrecen, Hungary, with his paper Border Territory Targeted by Rival National Narratives, the Burgenlande debate between the Austrian and Hungarian historical writings, 1821, 1945. You're welcome. The floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, okay, just let me share my screen. Okay, so my main field of study is the history of historical writing and historical theory. So in the next section, I won't present so-called objective picture about the history of Burgenland, but rather I will concentrate on the different narratives and different discourses surrounding its past. And currently I'm working on a book that will deal with these questions, mainly from a historiographical point of view. So border regions of national states have always played an important role in the process of national identity construction. Nation, as an imagined community, relies both on territory and history. Borders clearly separate the national community from the other, the us from them. But borders are contested as frequent as identities. This means that usually two or more nations compete for the historical rights to a border region. It was an important task of the national historical writing in the 20th century to nationalize border regions, this way openly challenging the identity of a neighboring country. The Alsace-Lorraine or the Transylvania question clearly proves that debates over border regions ignited bitter conflicts in history. Border regions were essential and at the same time debated parts of national master narratives, but especially this contested nature of borders gives a great opportunity to analyze the relationship between historical writing and national history. The region Burgenland was transferred to Austria in 1921. And after the First World War, the country was compensated with a territory that had previously been a part of Hungary. Since the birth of the region, it has been heavily contested mostly by Hungarian and sometimes Czech historians. Of course, the Austrian historical writing was eager to integrate Burgenland into its national history. The aim of my research is to present a comparative and a transnational history of the Austrian and Hungarian historical professions, and to show how historians across different borders participated in creating histories based on nation, empire, region, or ethnicity. The case of Burgenland in the interwar period is a good example of identity construction through historical writing. I will identify the main actors and institutes of knowledge production and show the most important elements of rival national narratives. I intend to concentrate on certain questions and topics that emerged during the historical discourses. Who has even the right to write about the history of Burgenland or Western Hungary, which has been subjected to both Hungarian and Austrian political rule in the course of its history? Was it the political identity or the ethnicity of the population that mattered? Which nation can claim the famous musicians or writers of the region? Geographers and historians repeatedly posed questions like what kind of regional character does Burgenland have, Eastern, Western, or mixed? The role of minorities, Croats, Jews, and Gypsies were also discussed. As indicated before, my research is a transnational history. However, it will also rely on the methods of comparative history, as both sides must be analyzed. This is the reason I emphasize both transnational and comparative elements in my research. Such historical debates also offer an insight into the different logic of knowledge production. A closer examination of the Burgenland debate can show that the professional legitimacy of Austrian and Hungarian historians was repeatedly challenged. Although these historians wrote their work according to professional methods, so for example, they relied on source criticism, the meaning of this professionalism was frequently discussed. In these heated debates, it is particularly visible that historians used scholarly language, so they mentioned that relying on sources is an essential part of being a good historian, or one should be objective, devoid of political sentiments and ideology, although they use this scholarly language even in those debates that cannot be decided alone by rational or cognitive means. So, for example, one cannot decide the antagonism between political, state-centered civic nationalism and ethnic cultural nationalism by relying only on rational arguments or sources. Two cities, Sopron in German Ödenburg and Eisenstadt in Hungarian Kismarton, were of utmost importance for the historians standing on different sides of the border. These cities served as popular topics of national historical narratives, but they also functioned as centers organizing historical research. Historians working for city libraries, archives, museums, and local journals were keen to participate in debates about this border region. For example, both the leading archivist of Eisenstadt, Heinrich Kunnert, and the director of the archive of the city of Sopron, Jenő Házy, joined the heated discussions about Burgenlande. The problem of Sopron was a complex case because after the war, this border city was promised to Austria, following the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919. However, the Venice Protocol in 1921 allowed that the fate of Sopron can be decided with a referendum. And the referendum took place in December 1921, and the majority of the local population voted for Hungary. After this political event, two entirely different historical interpretations emerged. The Austrian historical writing contested the results of the referendum, declaring it as fraud, and argued that the city has an essentially German ethnic character. The booklet of Viktor Milczynski, Das Verbrechen von Ödenburg, that means the crime of Sopron, referring to the fraud elections, according to him, stated that Sopron is a part of an ancient German territory, and the assimilation policy of Hungary in the period of the dualist Austro-Hungarian monarchy was not successful here. The sorrow over the loss of Sopron is clearly present in the writings of another local historian, Otto Aul, too. He was in Wiener Neustadt, and he was one of the most famous local historians in Burgenland at that time. He eagerly attacked the Hungarian national position in newspaper articles and books, and in the 1980s, he repeatedly argued that Austria has a historical right to Sopron because the majority of its population belonged to the German folk, according to him. And contrary to this position, Hungarian historians, jurists, and geographers argued that the territory, now called Burgenland, has always been an integral part of the Hungarian state, and ethnic identity did not matter in this region's history. And one of the first books celebrating the referendum of Sopron tried to defend the concept of an integral Hungarian state, national state, and this volume, called Sopron Civitas Fidelissima, was edited by Gustav Thierling, an expert at geography and demography. And Thierling, it is an interesting case because Thierling was born into a German-speaking family, but he was a devoted Hungarian nationalist. And he stressed that the result of the referendum was just a spontaneous manifestation of a historically evolved patriotic sentiment of the population. And according to him, the German citizens of Sopron were always loyal to the Hungarian nation state. And according to him, it was just so the results of the referendum were just natural things. So it's not much to be discussed here. And Thierling published later several articles and books about the social and economic history of Sopron, and while relying on the methods of social sciences, at that time these methods were really modern, so he used statistics and maps. And although he relied on these methods, he maintained the Hungarian nationalist agenda throughout his works. The border city on the Austrian side, Eisenstadt, did not receive particular attention until 1925, when it became the provincial capital of Burgenland. And in 1931, the regional authorities celebrated the 10th anniversary of Burgenland. And it was part of the regional memory politics that Otto Aul published a comprehensive history of Eisenstadt. And the book emphasized that all ethnic groups of the city, even the Jews and the Hungarians, were integrated into the German culture and used the German language in their everyday communication. And in his historical overview, Aul condemned the expensive lifestyle and Catholic orientation of Hungarian aristocrats, namely the family of Esterházy, who lived in Eisenstadt. And he rather sided with the supposedly democratic and Protestant German folk of the city population. But Hungarian historian and archivist Jenő Házy from Sopron, he challenged Aul's point of view in a critical review about the book, which was published in the leading Hungarian journal for history, in the Századok, which can be translated in centuries. And in this review, Házy belittled the cultural relevance of the German-speaking population in Eisenstadt and focused instead on the deeds of the Hungarian family Esterházy. And in Házy's opinion, it were the members of the Esterházy family who made Eisenstadt a center of culture, for example, by supporting and financing famous musicians like Joseph Haydn, for example. And it is striking how historical interpretations changed over time. After the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in 1938, the history of Eisenstadt was reframed in a radical way. On the Austrian side, Heinrich Kunnert published a small book about the city, which aimed to guide the readers throughout its history, art, and environment. And in his booklet, Kunnert called the Jewish inhabitants of Eisenstadt as members of a parasite race, and argued for their deportation. And in the year Kunnert's book was published in 1939, Burgenland ceased to exist as a region since its territory was divided between Unterdonau and Styria. In the 1930s, some considerable shifts took place in the ranks of Austrian and Hungarian historical writing. The research on the history of Burgenland became much more organized, and the new historical approach started to gain momentum. The German Südostforschung viewed Burgenland as a vital bridgehead for future cultural and political expansion. And the goal of these German Southeast studies was, on one hand, to collect all kinds of data on Germans living abroad, and on the other hand, to support research in connection with their history, anthropology, economy, and sociology. And this complex knowledge was then utilized to support the territorial expansion of Germany. And the institute coordinating the related research, the Südost Institute, was established in München in 1930. And from 1936, the institute published an official journal called Südostforschungen. This journal still exists nowadays, which became a new scientific and political forum for Austrian historians. For example, local historians living in Burgenland, like Otto Aul, Heinrich Kunnert, or Ernst Löger, now had a chance to publish their articles there, aiming for a broader readership. And even in the first volume of the journal in 1936, we encounter several Burgenland-related articles. For example, Ernst Löger analyzed the history of education in Western Hungary or Burgenland in an extensive article and criticized the Hungarian assimilation policy of the 19th century. And besides these German Südostforschung, there existed a vast network of research groups in Germany that supported an ethnic, German folkish view of history, and this orientation was called Volksgeschichte. These research groups were called Volksdeutsche Forschungsgemeinschaften, and they had 6 different centers. One of them, the Südostdeutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, was established in Vienna in 1931. And the head of this research group, this Forschungsgemeinschaft, was Hugo Hassinger, a professor of geography at the University of Vienna. And Hessinger's interests covered both historical and geographical topics. And his group was very influential because it was supported financially by Germany. And this group managed to connect Austrian historians living in Vienna and historians living in Burgenland. So this Südostdeutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft had members in the state archives of Vienna, for example, Lothar Gross or Ludwig Bittner, in the Institute of Austrian Historical Research, the director of this institute, Hans Hirsch, was also a member, and the regional archive of Burgenland in Eisenstadt, Heinrich Kunert, and those local historians in Burgenland who subscribed to this Völkisch view of history had their scientific career secured and had much more publishing opportunities also. And one of the joint scientific projects of this group was the so-called Burgenland Atlas in 1941, which consisted of dozens of high-quality maps and lengthy commentary texts explaining the history depicted on these maps. And it is a really interesting atlas because at that time when it was published, Burgenland did not exist anymore, so it was a kind of anachronism to call it Burgenland Atlas, and that's why it was not officially published. So, for example, the Hungarian historical writing did not write a reaction to it because one of the Hungarian historians at that time, Miklós Kring, wrote in a review that he just could not find an exemplar of this atlas, so he cannot write an answer to it. And at that time, the leading representatives of the Volksgeschichte, for example, Ernst Kleber, Otto Brunner, Heinrich Kunert, Konrad Schünemann, Otto Albrecht Isbert, so they published articles and books about the history of the German population in Burgenland. The main elements of this approach can be illustrated with one study published by Otto Brunner in 1932, and in Das Burgenland, that was the title of his paper. Brunner emphasized that the region rightfully belongs to Austria, but not because of a diplomatic treaty or as a political result of the First World War. According to him, Burgenland had always been an integral part of the German ethnic bloc. He called it the German Volksboden. Thus, the Hungarian rule, the political rule, was only a transitional period in its history. And according to him, it is true that the regional elite was Hungarian, but the majority of the population spoke German. And therefore, it was the peasantry that preserved the German character of this territory. And in contrast to many other Hungarian scholars debating the Austrian Burgenland histories, like we saw Jenő Házy, Gustav Tilling, a younger generation of Hungarian historians became open to the methods and ideas of the German Volksgeschichte, and they tried to use this scientific toolkit against Austrian and German historians while challenging their histories about population and urban history. And an expert at population and county history, Elemér Május, propagated an ethnic concept of the nation, so not a political one like Tilling or Házy Jenő, which meant that he considered the territory of Burgenland as a Hungarian Boden, so a part of a Hungarian ethnic bloc. And Május taught Hungarian history at the University of Budapest, and he had many followers. And one of his pupils, Márton Kovács, researched the social and ethno-history of the Hungarian diaspora living in Burgenland, especially the minority groups around Felső, Obervár, about which we heard a presentation. And his approach was similar to his Austrian colleagues. He concentrated much more on the peasantry because, according to Kovács, the lower ranks of society represented the authentic Hungarian culture. And in opposition to this ordinary folk, this ordinary Hungarian folk, the Hungarian aristocrats like the family of Esterházy or Batthyány played a negative role in the Hungarian history of Burgenland because they sympathized with the Habsburgs and they did not care about the ethnic background of the population under their rule. So the landholders hired German, Slavic, Jewish and Hungarian workers alike. And according to Kovács and the Volksgeschichte, it was a mistake from them that they did not consider the ethnic background as an important factor. And Kovács presented the ethnohistory of Felső as a kind of infinite war between ethnic blocs. And in his opinion, Austria has almost won this war because the Germans in this region has received ethnic reinforcements. It was his wording much faster than the Hungarians since the 16th century. And the book of Kovács intended to be a wake-up call for the Hungarian authorities that they should do something to preserve the Hungarian diaspora outside the state borders. And you can see a quote from his book. I translated it from Hungarian, and I think this quote illustrates that this Hungarian Volksgeschichte was a kind of militant historical writing. So they did not want to be objective, devoid of political sentiment, but they thought of historical writing as a tool for war between nations. And you can see in this text that Kovács openly praises the blood sacrifices. So he thinks that the more one nation sacrifices his blood for a territory, in this particular case for the territory for Oberwart, the more historical rights one nation has to the territory. I think it is not a surprise that the book of Kovács attracted attention of Austrian and German historians across the border. And one historian from Graz, Bernhard Zimmermann, reviewed the volume in the journal Südostforschungen. So you can see from this fact that the Austrian-Hungarian debates were fought in German forums. So this means that by this time, the German historical writing had a real big influence on this debate. And in this critical review, Zimmermann, for one part, he acknowledged some merits of Kovács, for example, his critical handling of the sources, but he belittled the cultural relevance of Hungarian communities living in Felső, because in Zimmermann's opinion, they did not even publish a Hungarian newspaper, implying that their history is not that important even from a Hungarian perspective. So he did not think it is important to research these groups. And to summarize the results, I think that historians played a huge role in stabilizing or destabilizing the results of territorial changes. However, evoking the past could be utilized to question these changes as well. While the Austrian and German historians emphasize the 1,000-year-long German ethnic continuity in the history of Sopron or Eisenstadt, some Hungarian scholars held the ethnic component less important and relied on a political territorial concept of the nation. Hungarian historians also did not acknowledge the legitimacy of a new region called Burgenland. They viewed it as a part of a greater Hungary, so the Hungarian state before the Treaty of Trianon, or as a Hungarian Kulturboden, like the representatives of Hungarian Volksgeschichte did. So they thought that the political concept of a nation is not enough because what will happen then the Hungarian diaspora outside the state's borders. And as we have seen, the historians had different opinions about nationality, and but their common goal was to homogenize an otherwise multicultural border region through writing its history. And it can be also observed that the more professional a historian was, the easier it became for him to advance his career and participate in national historical debates and vice versa. So it was not rare that precisely those local historians of Burgenland could work together with Viennese historians or German historians in the long run, who were also frequent opponents of Hungarian historians like Kunnert, Aul or Milczynski. And The referendum of, it is interesting because the referendum of Sopron is nowadays the center of attention in Hungary, especially for the memory politics. And the referendum of Sopron was at the center of many national historic narratives at that time also. And it was the peak or the lowest point in the history of Sopron, depending on which side of the border a historian stood. So for Hungarian nationalists, this event made every history of Sopron a kind of theological fulfillment of a historical destiny. And this interpretation, which is still flourishing in present-day Hungary, silences the fact that not everyone acknowledged the legitimacy of this referendum. And but the Austrian side often tied political views to the ethnic background of the population, this way limiting the possibility of free thinking outside of ethnic determinants. And by highlighting the German ethnic character of Sopron or Eisenstadt, they also attempted to destabilize or question the right of Hungary to these cities. And in my presentation, of course, I did not aim to achieve completeness, since the Burgenlande debate between historians was an extensive discourse in the interwar period. Rather, I tried to show as many aspects of this debate as possible in a short overview. And these historical antagonisms targeted cities, persons, and different concepts of the nation. And my argument is that border situations like this are excellent opportunities to study the interactions between identity and historical writings, but also to gain knowledge about the mechanisms and logics of the historical profession. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, for the insight into the discussions and controversies of national historiographies, and I would also say probably young national historiographies, because after the Treaty of Versailles, both Austrian and Hungarian historiographies reincarnated, so to say, in new geographical parameters. Are there any questions from our audience? Andrea, please.
Yes, thank you very much. This was really very interesting for me, and I think for all the others as well. This also answers some questions that I had regarding the conception of Burgenland and the reception of Burgenland in the history, and it seems that it hasn't always been easy to write about Burgenland, to find the proper position as a historian on Burgenland. So maybe that's why this part of Austria has, in my opinion, been really neglected as far as research is concerned, and you can hardly find any really reliable sources from former times about this. It's either, as you said, the ethnic or the political approach, and not the way in the middle. So, but what I would like to ask you is, after I would say after the Cold War, there were some forums established in Burgenland that wanted to bring together historians from, of course, the Hungarian topic being the focused on, from all parts of Hungary and Austria, and I don't know, Croats also, these Schleininger Gespräche, Mogersdorfer Gespräche. What did you ever hear about them? I think yes, you must have heard about that. Yes. What is your opinion on these later developments? So this is, I'm aware that it's not what you were talking about, but what is your awareness on this? Because I was never able to somehow evaluate these.
Okay, so it is really hard to speak about, for example, a united Austrian narrative or a united Austrian historical writing versus the united Hungarian historical writing. Even at that time I spoke about, we can observe some historians who did not participate in these debates because, for example, in Sopron, there was a rabbi who was also a historian, a local historian of Sopron, Max Pollak, and he wrote the history of Sopron according to Jewish perspective. So he thought that neither Hungarian nationalism nor Austrian nationalism can say anything to him. So because the Jewish population of Sopron always suffered also from part of Hungarian and Austrian deeds, so he did not want to join these national debates. So even at that time were some outsiders. But the picture is even more differentiated in nowadays. So, for example, in Hungary, there is a nationalist historical writing which claims that that the Sopron belongs rightfully to us, and it was the most loyal city of Hungary, and they praise this loyalty, but I think they neglect the fact that this discourse of loyalty was, after the referendum, was used against the minorities, against Germans and Jews living in Sopron, because Hungarian authorities thought that okay, they surely did not vote for Hungary, they surely did vote for Austria, and that's why they persecuted and discriminated them. So the nationalist historical writings in nowadays Hungary neglects these facts and praises these referendum. And also, I can see some nationalist development in Austrian historical writing, which claims that the Burgenland as a territory has a 100-year-long history, because there was a time, more than 100 years, when it belonged, some part of it, not all Burgenland, but some part of it, was integrated to Habsburg rule. So, for example, the city of Eisenstadt, these cities were pawned off to Habsburgs, and sometimes the Austrian historical writings thinks about these pawning of territories as annexed territories. So it's like the first episode of national Austrian history in the case of Burgenland, but this is some case it is rather an anachronism. But this is just one perspective on this region. Also in Austria, I think those historians who approach the history of Burgenland from a cultural historical way, or gender history, or anthropological history, or social history, like, for example, Ursula Mindler, who wrote about the Jewish population of Oberwart. I think her book is really good. So these historians do not to these nationalist agendas. So I think the solution might be that we should orient it toward these social historical methods, or these cultural historical methods, and this way we can combat these national histories. These histories often rely on the political histories, so the great political events, the great political leaders, and they only view this Burgenland question from above. You can say that. And I think that both in Hungary and in Austria, I think that those historians who approach from a social historical way, they can be regarded as not much more objective, but much more useful or progressive in this respect. So I think that it depends on what kind of historical methods and what kind of historical school one historian belongs to. So, but I think that in Hungary now, a state-centered political history is so it can remain. It can be regarded as a mainstream. So and also it poses difficult questions, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have two colleagues who want to ask their questions. And first was Alexander Dronov. He is a research fellow at our institute and an expert on another historical region, military borders. So let's listen to a question from an expert on military border to an expert on Burgenlande. Alexander Mikhailovich, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very interesting report. Yes, I study another border region, Croatia, and border military border. Yes, and I think we can look at the history of Burgenland as an old border region between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. As far as I understood, the Austrian historians actually nationalized the hereditary lands of the Habsburg dynasty, and I have a question. Did the Austrian historians appeal to the history of the Holy Roman Empire to substantiate the German claims and to German pretensions to this land? Did they write that this was once the territory of the Holy Roman Empire? Thank you.
Okay, so just one short comment on the Habsburgs. You mentioned them also. So the Austrian historians nationalized the Habsburgs, but they also criticized them because, for example, Otto Ohl wrote that the Habsburgs, just like the Hungarian aristocrats, did not care about the ethnic background of the population. So the Habsburgs just let those territories go back to Hungary, which were pawned off to Austria in the Middle Ages, and that's why mainly all Austrian and German historians criticized the Habsburgs from a national point of view. This was just a short comment on Habsburgs. And regarding the question of the Roman Empire, there were also archaeology in Eisenstadt at that time. So Alphonse Barbe can be and should be mentioned. He dealt with ancient history, but it is an interesting case because he dealt with ancient history not from a national point of view. So he was like, okay, let's collect all monuments and findings from Roman times in the territory of Burgenland, because it shows that the civilization can be traced far back to the ancient times, and it shows that Burgenland was always a civilized territory. So this way and also the Burgenland regional politics supported the excavations in Burgenland and the study of Roman times. And there were also historians, but they were rather dilettantes, I think, because they were not trained historians or ancient historians, who traced back the German population even to the Roman times. So mainly the Austrian historians wrote that there is a 1,000-year continuity in Burgenland, but there were those who went much further back in time, even to the Roman times. So I think it was researched. It was researched.
Thank you very much for that history come back to the old ancient times of Roman Empire, but my question was about Holy Roman Empire of German nation.
Sorry.
German Empire, the Habsburg was the leaders, the monarchs of this empire, and but also they had hereditary length of their dynasty. So Austrian lands and other German lands, but the couple of all these lands was the territory of Holy Roman Empire, and so it was I think very important border between historic border between this empire and other lands, so Hungarian, Croatian lands, we can name these lands, and it was my question was about this border, historic border. I know that Habsburgs and Hungarian kings, they had in different times they own Burgenlande. But the historians in 20th century, what they think, what did they think about these times, these territory of pretensions of Hungarians and Germans?
Okay, sorry to have misunderstood your question regarding. Okay, so a type of historical view was dominant in the local historical writing of Burgenlande. It saw the history of the Holy Roman Empire and also the history of Germany as united with these border regions. So basically they viewed this border region as a wall against Slavic and Hungarian and other so-called barbarian influences. So for example, Tatars or Turkish military advances, and they viewed all these German populations living there as a kind of border guard and a kind of wall against Hungarians who allied themselves with sometimes with Turks and sometimes with Tatars. So they thought that this border is at those times served as a civilization border. So they projected back their ethnic concept of the nation back to these times.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for making this excursion into the ancient history, because sometimes we really forget the role of these limes in a civilizational and historical, archaeological, whatever respect. And we really should not forget that the Roman legions were located on the territory of the present-day Burgenland, and we may think about Marcus Aurelius, Carnuntum, whatever. And I think these, from time to time, is also exploited by arguing publicists and journalistically orientated historians. So I think it was a very, very important compliment. But we have another question from also research fellow of junior research fellow of our institute, from Viktor Kotov. He is an expert on one of the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, on Bohemia. So Viktor Viktorovich, please.
Check. Yes, thank you for your interesting and well-structured talk. These historical discussions have reminded me not only about the military frontier, but also the Czech-German interwar conflict in Sudetenland. The Sudetenland discussion was really heated already in the 1860s. So I wanted to ask if these discussions about Burgenland or Western Hungarian region have started only after the First World War, or if there was some sort of a prehistory in the Habsburg period, for example, in the Kronprinzen work mentioned in the first talk, or some other publication in the 19th century. Thank you.
This is an interesting question because I started my narrative after the First World War, but yes, we can trace back this debate to earlier times. So, for example, we have a historian in Hungary called Ferenc Janko, who wrote a book about, not about the historical writing, but about the geography and how geography took part in these debates. And he wrote that geographers, even before the First World War, established some elements of the narratives that will take shape only after the First World War. And for example, you can read the works of József Patry. He was a journalist and politician in the Habsburg monarchy. And in 1906, he wrote a book, Deutsch-Ungarn zu Österreich, and he argued that these parts of Hungary, so these western parts of Hungary, must be given to Austria because German-speaking population lives there, and the majority of the population speaks German, and Hungary should be compensated with territory on the Balkans. And this was for him an exchange, and he tried to convince Austrian politicians that this Western Hungary belongs to Austria. So yes, there were debates before the First World War, but the influence of József Patry was limited at that time. And this debate is ignited rather after the First World War, rather after the creation of Burgenland, but not without antecedents.
More questions? Julia Wood, please. Yekaterinburg is talking.
Thank you very much. And I actually have, I think, a short question. I liked very much your remark about that Martin Kovac used historical writing as a tool in the war between nations. And my question is whether this bellicose mood, bellicose rhetoric was characteristic for all the Hungarian writers during the period in question, and maybe it was also characteristic for the German side, the German counterparts, and who of them was more aggressive, more combative in this discussion.
Okay, thank you for your question. This is really interesting because those historians who I mentioned at the first part of my presentation, for example, Házy Jenő, Tiring Gustav, they referred to the sources, to objectivity, and they questioned the legitimacy of Austrian historians based on this argument that one should be objective, devoid of ideology, and devoid of political sentiments. So there was this kind of historical writing. It was no less nationalistic, but at least the discourse was centered around this objectivity question. And there were those who, like Május Elemér Zajldler and Márton Kovács. This was a separate school of historical writing in Hungary, so not everyone was like this, but this school copied the discourse. So yes, it is safe to say that they copied the rhetorics of German Volksgeschichte, and the German Volksgeschichte was a militant one, and there are good literature on this school of historical writing. It was supported by the Nazis, of course, and these historians of Germans viewed themselves as warriors also, so not just objective historians, but also warriors. And this kind of historical writing was much more dominant in Austria and in Germany than in Hungary. For example, in Hungary, the Conservative Academy of Sciences blocked the enterprise of Május Elemér. So Május Elemér tried to establish a whole how to say, department in the Academy of Hungary, in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, to emulate these methods of the German Volksgeschichte. But the leaders of the academy said that, okay, this sounds like some Nazi thing, so we don't want to let this happen. So the Hungarian historical writing was a little bit divided in this respect. And also the Austrian historical writing was also divided at first, but after the German historical writing influenced them more and more, it was more and more united behind these militant Volksgeschichte. But this is not to say that the one side was much more objective than the other side, but yes, I would condemn these militant Volksgeschichte. I don't really like it, because many of these historians, for example, who took part in Burgenlande Atlas, they also sketched maps showing Roma and Jewish population, and by showing the spatial portion or these minority groups, they also try to draw attention of the military. So let's depict these minority groups in space, in a spatial context, to make them visible and make it easy to deport them on the long run. So yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? I do not see hands, and then it means I may ask my questions. I have several ones, and maybe the first, listening to your paper, I was thinking about Goethe's essay on the Cathedral of Strasbourg. Do people refer to this or similar literary and aesthetically perfect texts when they were defending their position on these questioned territories? My second question is, if we talk about historical regions like Bánság or Upper Hungary, Felső Magyarország, they have longer prehistory. So as historical regions with different borders, different functions, different meanings, they have a longer history than Burgenland. Maybe Burgenland, one of the most young historical regions, and maybe you are the proper person to ask, do we know who did invent this name? Because it's a construction, but I've never seen in general works on the origin of the term. Then my third question is to other personalities of the historical and political spectrum of Hungary in the interwar period. You told us about Május, and I started thinking about Szekfő and his neglection of 19th century liberalism, his blaming of 18th century Enlightenment, all these things. Does his position somehow meet with Május, or that camp on the issues of Burgenland, lost territories, mixed identities, and maybe to the same question also belong Kuno Klebelsberg, and what was his attitude to this, particularly this region, as a minister who intended to symbolically reunite Hungary in historical writing. So maybe I have more questions, but let us limit to this, maybe most important ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I will start from the last one. So the historical writing of Gyula Szekfű, it is interesting for me because Gyula Szekfű was a opponent of Volksgeschichte, so he did not like Május Elemér at all. They had their rooms at the same university, but they never greeted each other. so that was a real deep antagonism between the two, because Gyula Szekfű was propagator of the political nation state, so he thought that applying the methods of Volksgeschichte would lead to anti-Semitism and the dissimulation of German population in Hungary, and he did not want that, and he referred back to the King Saint Stephen of Hungary, and Gyula Szekfű presented the King of Hungary as a kind of tolerant king towards the minorities and the national groups, and that's why he cultivated his memory against Május and Elemér Május. But also the antagonism was also about what should a historian cover in his narrative. So Gyula Szekfű concentrated much more on political history and Geistesgeschichte, so the history of ideas. And Elemér Május was much more open to sociology. So it is really interesting. It is hard to evaluate their antagonism, because sometimes Elemér Május relied on much modern methods in historical writing, but politically he was a little bit closer to these racist or ethnicist thinking. So Gyula Szekfű was a much more conservative historian with conservative topics. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, but he openly challenged this kind of thinking. And as far as I know, Gyula Szekfű did not write much about this Burgenland question. It was rather Május who concentrated on it. And Klebelsberg Kuno, the official policy of Hungary at that time was that that Austria is a friendly nation, because compared with Romania, for example, Kuno Klebelsberg supported debates with much more vehemence against Romania, and the official policy in Hungary concentrated much less on the Burgenland debate, because they thought it is hard to argue that Burgenland is a part of Hungary, because in other regions, Hungarian policy or Klebelsberg argued that, okay, a lot of Hungarians still living outside state borders, but in Burgenland this argument was harder to sustain. And that's why they refer to it less. It does not mean that Hungarian historians did not participate in debates, but in this respect, politics and historical writing was not the same. So those historians who I mentioned, Gustav Thering or Jenő Házy, they participated in this debate because they lived close to the border, and it was for them kind of local patriotic duty to review the work of Austrian historians. But we can see also historians from Budapest taking this question seriously. I did not mention Sándor Domanovsky. He was the president of the Hungarian Historical Association and also the chief editor of the Századok. And it is not by chance that this journal debated frequently the works of Austrian historians, and especially works written by the Burgenland question, because Domanovsky himself thought this this is a national mission to undermine the Austrian national narratives regarding Burgenland. So the historical writing and politics went into not entirely different way, because Klébersberg-Kuno was also nationalist, but he concentrated much more on other regions. And this was the third question. And the second one, the name of Burgenland. At first, many other names were created, like Deutsch-Westungarn or Für Burgenland. One of the first journals established in 1990, I think, was called Für Burgenland. It was four in its name because it contained also Pressburg, so Pozsony, and at that time they thought that the historical region Burgenland must consist of this also. But the name of Burgenland will only appear in 1920s, I think. The first Festschrifts and journals use this name, and previously I did not encounter with this name also. And yes, it is a common place to mention that with Burgenland, the name represents these counties, historical counties of Hungary, the German names of these counties. So it does not refer to the castles in this territory, but rather the names of counties. And sorry, the first question, the first part of the first question, I did not understand clearly. So
now I asked about the famous essay of Wolfgang Goethe, which was dedicated to the role of Strasbourg Cathedral in German history. So he was looking at a German cathedral on French territory and was reflecting on the role of an extraterritorial symbol of German nation. So I thought maybe people who were debating in the 19th century were using strong arguments from such a classical writer of European Enlightenment as Goethe, but maybe they did not at all. Although the story is very similar to German attitude on the other part of the German world to French-German discussion on the, so to say, disputed territories. That was the.
I don't have knowledge about them referring to Goethe.
Okay, thank you. Andrea wanted to say something. I see her hand.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say about the name of Burgenland. This is really interesting because this area never had a real name. And we rather, if we think in historical categories, then we are talking rather about Pozsony vármegye, Sopron vármegye, and so on and so on. But I find it very interesting that there was also, for Burgenland, there was also this Hungarian word várvidék. But it somehow it got lost. It's nobody is using it. Even in Hungary now, nobody's using it. Everybody refers to it as Burgenland. It's also interesting when this disappeared.
I think that from the reason for this is that from all the historical regions that got lost in the Treaty of Trianon, it was the easiest to cope with the loss of Burgenland, and that's why these Várvidék and also Örvidék, these names, these Hungarian names, did not last. No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe more questions?
Can I ask something else?
Yeah.
Just very shortly. I wanted to ask you, have you seen or have you visited any of these exhibitions recently of 100 Jahre Burgenland?
I did not, but I read the book edited by Olivier Radkorb, the same title of this book, and I think the exhibition you are referring to is in connection with this book, because the name is the title is the same.
Yes, it's I think he is the curator of the Schleining Burg Schleining exhibition. Well, but there is also an exhibition in Güssing, or was an exhibition in Güssing, which was exactly in the opposite way, incredibly nationalistic, you know, from the Austrian point of view, incredibly nationalistic. So I was thinking you might have seen that. And I was rather astonished about the way how they, I mean, it's not necessary in 2022 to somehow completely neglect the fact that the Hungarians were dominating this area for hundreds of years, and it looked as if the Hungarians had been intruders or invaders, and finally we got over them. It was very interesting for me that it's even occurs that somebody is curating an exhibition for such an event from this point of view. That was really astonishing.
Something I heard about this debate, for example, Gerhard Baumgartner criticized it, as I know, but not further details. Just one comment, that you mentioned that you are astonished that these narratives are still flourishing, or we can encounter them. I think that one reason for that is you can see that studying historiography shows that when you try to search for books about this region, you inevitably encounter these old national narratives in these old books, and some people will refer to it as okay, these are objective even by today's standards. Yeah. And for example, in the Hungarian side, I read some similar nationalist books, and they refer to these debates back, and they call these Hungarian nationalist historians as the right side. So they present their arguments with comments like, okay, Házi Jenő and Thierry Gustav and so on, they are still valuable evaluation for the history of Burgenland. So they do not criticize them in this respect, but use them as a source or literature. I think that history or historical writing, not all members of historical writing, but historical writing contributed to establishing these national narratives and to fuel these conflicts, and it will do in the future also. So
I think so too. Okay, thank you very much.
Maybe I have one question. I do not know, maybe Andrea knows it better, or Laszlo David. I started thinking about the role of local commerce in instrumentalizing of the history. So wine producers, for example, are they part of some cultural debate? Do they take part of nationalist one or another? How they exploit the picturesque history of Burgenland, or do they make their business, so to say, without historical references? So how is it from touristic and commercial point of view?
So there are, I did not mention pamphlets or tourist guides from these times and from today, but we can also observe this phenomena that Burgenland for local tourists is presented like exotic regions. So the mixture of Western and Eastern geographical traits. And yes, to answer your question, I think that local authorities exploit it and also ally themselves with these narratives of historians. And also we can see the overlap in different functions. So for example, historians who wrote about the history of Burgenland also wrote tourist guides. So they did both sometimes.
Yes, this is really true what you say, but I would say that as you said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm often in Burgenland, and I think that you are right in this, that historians are mixing up with tourism and also writing handbooks, and I also encountered this in this when my book now, that a person who is in fact a historian, he more or less wrote an essay on Burgenland, and they have these romantic questions on Burgenland identity. What are we? You know, are we Hungarians? Are we Austrians? And so on. And this question can never be, of course, never be solved because it's nonsense. but then they come with all this traditional stuff. What are we eating? Are we eating rokot krumpli or not? And things like this. That's all the nonsense. But yes, in this respect, yes. But I would say when you come to Burgenland or you visit Burgenland, if you don't know that there are Hungarians there and Croatians there, I don't think that you really realize that it's a multinational region. You think so? There are some villages, some like Unterwart or Siget, but generally it's not influencing Burgenland at all. I mean, these little territories that remained around Oberwart and in the middle Burgenland, these Croatian territories that remain. But other than this, I would not say that I agree on that what you said, that it's very popular to jump on this train and but I wouldn't say that is dominating like for instance in Hungary where you see all this mako and goulash soup and noproforgo, etc. You don't have this in Burgenland. So Burgenland is not referring to the Hungarian past in that way. I don't think so. Do you think so? I know. I don't.
Mainly, sorry, I mainly refer period. So I think that you have much more knowledge about how things are.
I'm talking about nowadays Hungary. I'm talking about nowadays Hungary. And as I said, when I grew up in Hungary in Burgenland in the 50s and in the 60s, it was rather a shame to be Hungarian. You know, the people avoided to talk about the fact that they are Hungarians, and they didn't teach their children Hungarian. Even the Hungarian minority, they didn't teach their children Hungarian because they were ashamed. You know? This was a second-class language. You know? So that's why I find it still so astonishing that in these areas like Burgenland, but also Carinthia, that in these areas the children, they learned French and they learned English and Spanish, but they don't speak the language of their neighboring countries at all. That's interesting. Yeah. So in this respect, I would say there is not a big propaganda towards the origin.
Thank you, Andrea. If we have no questions, I think we have spent wonderful 2 hours in a discussion of less known for us pages and aspects from the history of this historical region. And I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart, how to say, our dear speakers, Andrea, Laszlo, David, thank you very much. We expect to cooperate with you in the future, and we wish you a lot of success in your work, in your propaganda of true knowledge, and thank you all who have spent these 2 hours with us, dear audience. Let's meet on our other programs, and well, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for inviting us. All the best. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.